Hello and welcome to another episode of the Agency Leadership Podcast. I'm Chip Griffin.
And I'm Jenny Dietrich.
And today I thought, in honor of your birthday week when we're recording this, we're going to talk about remembering what it was like when we were young. Right after this. Well, that audio seemed to hiccup there a little bit for me, at least, but hey.
Oh, it didn't on my end. Weird.
Oh, okay. Well, listeners, you may have heard it hiccup, you may not have heard it hiccup, but it certainly hiccuped for me. In any case, first of all, happy early birthday.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
I actually did remember it this year, so I can call it out on the show, when usually I forget and realize it after the fact when I start seeing all the flood of happy birthdays in the Spin Sucks community.
Well, and now it's on your calendar as well. So
now it is on my calendar, so I will remember. And of course, I do have to thank my wife, Jen, because she's the one who prodded me and actually looked at my calendar for later in the week and called it out to me. So in any case, this topic is not really chosen because of that, but I thought that it is appropriate because what we're going to talk about today are, our jumping off point is going to be Gen Z employees and how you manage them effectively. This is a question that came up in the most recent SAGA community monthly meetup. It's something that came up in the Spin Sucks community as well in the past couple of days. And so how do we manage less experienced workers, shall we say? Because I always try to avoid speaking in terms of age, even when we're talking young folks, because you don't want to get yourself into age discrimination problems. And it really is more about experience than age in most cases. But I think as we go forward, we'll also realize that some of what we're going to talk about applies not just to folks with just a couple of years of experience, but in some cases 20 or 30 years of experience, depending on their mindset and approach. So the question I think usually comes down to, geez, I've got these employees, they're not particularly motivated, they don't have a sense of urgency, they're not coming up with their own ideas, I've got to give them all this direction, I've got to micromanage them in order to get the job done, it's stressing me out, what do I do?
Yes, that is normally how it comes up.
Did I encapsulate pretty much what you hear from agency owners? I know that is what I
verbatim
hear. What I hear.
That is what I hear. Yes, yes, and it was almost verbatim from the Spin Sucks community too, which was the words that were used were very precious with boundaries, which I see as well, and a lack of urgency around getting client work done, which I also see. And I think I don't think it's Gen Z. I think it's people. And it's less about how many, how old or young they are, and more about, to your point, how motivated they are in their jobs. Not everybody's a type A employee like we were. Not everybody is, self-disciplined and self-motivated. And so it's really figuring out if you're recruiting and hiring the right people versus trying to fit somebody into a role that they may not be best suited for.
Yeah. And look, I have sympathy for anyone who's hiring right now because it is challenging to find the right employee for whether you're an agency or lots of other things. We see this constantly. We see this in the macro numbers that get published, but we see it anecdotally every day in the conversations that we're having with people who are hiring. It is difficult. And so I think there's a tendency to cut corners in hiring and settle because you want to have the seat filled. And so I think it's making the problem worse today than perhaps it was 5 or 10 years ago, where the job market was a little bit more favorable to employers. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I don't think this is a new problem. It is not as you say, a Gen Z issue. It's something that's been around. It's just that those of us who are agency owners now, we're older, and a lot of our employees are younger. And we misremember what it was like to be a 20-something in the workforce because we remember our own experience. And and the fact is that most people who go on to become an agency owner, we're type A, we're workaholics, let's get this done, let's show what we can do. But if I do my best to work through my feeble memory back to some many years ago when I was surrounded by my peers who were in their 20s, there were a lot of them who weren't particularly motivated and weren't really self-starters and needed a lot of help and guidance. And so part of this, I think, is is new, but I think a large part of this is really just the way that the workforce has been for as long as I've been alive.
I will say that some new challenges have come up, especially since the pandemic. And I think where almost everybody is, especially from an agency perspective, are either remote or hybrid. Managing a team like that in a culture where you're not together is a lot more challenging. There are societal and cultural things that are happening in our world that affect some of the decisions that are being made. And quite honestly, like, there's one thing that drives me absolutely insane, and I try really hard to respect it, but it drives me crazy. We have partners and we have employees and we have contractors who are very like in their box on their boundaries. And if you ask them to do one thing outside of the box, even if it fits their scope of what they should be doing, they tell you no. And that drives me crazy because that's not the employee that I was, right? If you ask me, honestly, that's not an agency owner that I am, because if a client wants something and it's within our scope, we're going to do it. And, even things like, oh, you're going on vacation in 2 weeks. Let's take a look and think about all the things that need to happen before you go so that your team isn't left in the lurch. And they're like, no. Like, what do you mean, no? Yeah. So I think there are those things that are happening. I think we should recognize that society has changed and culture has changed, and certainly the way that we work has changed. But yes, there are. And now, as I think back into my 20s as well, I remember a couple of people who would just come to work at their desk, leave, and you didn't see them on nights or weekends like you did some of the rest of us.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I worked with many employees, coworkers who were, clock watchers, as I used to call them.
Yep.
I had at least a couple of employees over the course of my career that were absolute clock watchers. I recall very distinctly one junior employee that I had in one of my businesses many, many years ago who literally would sit there and look at the clock on the wall so that she could walk out the door at 5 p.m. on the dot. At like 4:58, she was donning her jacket so that she could walk out that door the minute the second hand, because, we used to have analog clocks in offices for all you young people who might be listening. And she was out the door just like that. It drove me bonkers. Absolutely madness. But a lot of this, and I think that the pandemic did certainly make a lot of this more challenging, particularly with the work from home. But I think that excuse is gone now, and we need to try to figure out how to manage effectively with that. Right. Because the solution isn't just to complain about work from home and how it's done this. Yes. The solution is that we need to change our approach to management to deal with that, and we need to change our approach to recruiting to deal with that. Yep. And I think fundamentally, some of these problems are endemic, but a lot of it comes down to bad recruiting and bad management. And I know most 100%. Owners who are listening don't want to hear that. Right. They want to hear that it's the employee's fault and they need to shape up, and that we can get them some outside help and it will solve it. It will not. You need to look in the mirror first. That's where this solution lies.
I have a really good friend who runs a business, not an agency, but she runs a business, and she complains constantly about her employees. And like, I'll go in to her retail location and I can interact with her employees. And I'm always like, why you're not happy with them? Because you've hired people that are yes men, that tell you yes no matter what, and don't challenge you, don't give you any ideas, don't bring new ideas, aren't motivated to do things. She gets really mad at me when I tell her this, but like, that's the truth, is she's hired people that she can, for lack of a better term, control, and because of her personality type. And so when you think about how you're recruiting, you have to think about, okay, do I want people exactly like me? Maybe some, but not all. Like, a room full of Ginnies would drive me batty, right? I have to live with one of them, let alone have to work with them. But like, really think about, what is your culture and what kinds of work needs to get done. And every organization needs team A and team B players. We do. You need a cross mix, and you need people who are willing to go the extra mile and people who are not. But you have to figure out how to manage those individuals. And it's just like having kids. Like, you can't parent kids the same way. One kid may excel in certain things and the other one does not. You have to parent differently. And you have to think about that as you're leading a team as well.
Well, I think you've just made a really great point there, which is you need to have a mix of A and B players. And that doesn't mean that you need to have C and D and F players, right?
No, right.
But you do need to have a mix because I've seen agencies that try to build all-star teams. All-star teams
I
do
tried
not
that.
work.
They don't.
They don't work. And they don't work not just in the agency world, but if we look in the sports world, there's a reason why most of these teams don't have all-stars. And it's not because they don't have the budgets. In many cases, there are teams out there that could afford to hire an entire team of all-stars to play for them. They don't, because all-stars need to have they need to have supporting actors and supporting players
Yep.
that help bring them along. Your agency needs that too. So part of it is you need to set your expectation that not everybody on your team is going to be an all-star. Again, doesn't mean you need to accept mediocre, but it does mean that you need to accept that they're not going to be just like you.
Right. Right. And really think about, so let's go back to the being very precious with their boundaries and lack of urgency around client requests. Like for an agency, in my mind, we do client service. So if there's a lack of urgency around client work, that's a problem. And that's a cultural issue that needs to be fixed, because if you're not delivering to clients what they need and when they need it, you're not going to have clients for very long. There are some things that
yes, but I think the first thing is you need to test it. Are you correct that they do not have a sense of urgency? Because one of the things that I see frequently is that everything becomes urgent, either on the client side or
Right.
on the boss, manager, owner side. And if you do that, then you become essentially the boy who cried wolf.
Right.
And so
Right.
you need to make sure that if you are going to say they don't have a sense of urgency, that it's a legitimate sense of urgency and that it's not a manufactured one. Because if you don't treat this correctly, then it becomes a problem, because they're never going to listen to you, because everything, oh my God, this is got to be done yesterday. And I know a lot of this comes from the client side. A lot of this is clients saying, I need this right now. And clients are great at, dallying on their end and then expecting us to make up for the time shortfall. So some of this does come down to how you manage the relationships with the clients, how you convey urgency, so that when you truly need urgency, you get it, but you can't expect it 24/7.
Right. And I would say that you truly need urgency in a crisis situation. Otherwise,
Absolutely.
almost nothing else is urgent. Like 24 hours, I need it today, kind of urgent. So there might be things to your
And it's
point,
not an emergency when your client forgot to ask you to do something until the last minute. That is not an emergency. I still want to try to accommodate it if I can, because that's the mindset of a good agency. But it's not an emergency.
It's not an emergency. No. I have an employee who was really struggling with meeting deadlines. And I couldn't, with one client, not all clients, just this one client. And I couldn't figure out why. And I would have conversations with her and she would just be like, I don't know. I just missed it. Or I didn't see the alert in our project management system. Or she kept making excuses. And it took me a long time. It probably took me 6 months to figure out that she was being abused by our client. I had no idea. And she was trying to protect the team and me from that. But in the meantime, it was beating her down so much that she just stopped doing the work. She just didn't do it. She didn't meet deadlines. And when it finally came out, I was like, oh my gosh, like, why are we just talking about this now? And she was like, very like, I was trying to protect everyone from it. I didn't think that we should all be abused. And we fired the client and she like rose back up to the top. But my point is that there are also situations in those kinds of situations where they might not be as meeting client expectations or as urgent as you think they should be on certain things, because there's something else going on. So you have to sort of dig into, we're almost like therapists, parents, bosses, all in one. We have to sort of figure out what it is that's actually happening. Because if it's not a cultural thing and they're working well in other situations, there might be something going on that you just don't know about.
Well, and that's why weekly one-on-ones with all of your direct reports is so important.
Yes.
That's your only chance to truly uncover some of these things, because and I think that this has become actually worse with work from home because people feel like, well, I'm on Slack with my employees all day,
Oh
every
yeah, no,
day.
no, it's not the
We're
same.
constantly Zooming, and so I talk to them plenty.
It's not the
No,
same.
you still need a
Yep,
dedicated one-on-one meeting every single week without
yep,
fail, never
yep.
canceled, only rescheduled if absolutely necessary. If you do not do that, you are not giving yourself the opportunity to hear about the abusive client, to hear about maybe the challenge that's going on in someone's personal life that's causing them to miss deadlines or those kinds of things or have additional pressure and stress. You need to know all of these things, and the one-on-one meeting is essential, and you need to shut up during those one-on-one meetings
Yep.
because I've sat in on one-on-one meetings, and too often the manager is just, yapping away and asking questions. Shut up, let the employee talk. Silence is good. If the employee doesn't want to talk, just sit there quietly.
Yeah,
Wait,
yeah,
wait for them to fill the gap.
yep.
If you don't do that, you are denying yourself the opportunity to have the best management tool available. And
That's exactly
I
right.
firmly believe if you want to change the behavior of employees, have those one-on-ones every single week without fail.
Yes, you cannot. You cannot. And I actually I'm doing a podcast episode on how most CEOs think they're really good at communications, and it's actually they're not. Almost no one is. And in the Spin Sucks community last week, I asked for some examples of leaders who are bad communicators, and some of that stuff came up: canceling meetings, canceling one-to-ones, and not rescheduling them, never talking one-on-one with your employees or your contractors, interrupting, not listening. Like all of those things came up in the conversation we had in the Spin Sucks community, and we're none of us are immune from that, right? Like so if you can look at your clients and go, wow, he or she's a really bad communicator and it's because this and this, also take that introspectively and say, am I unknowingly doing the same things?
Right. And the communications piece is essential too. You need to be communicating. If there is a sense of urgency, communicate that to the team member. If their performance is not up to par, communicate that, but not in the way of shame on you, you're not doing your job. Communicate, give constructive feedback. If you're not giving constructive feedback, then you can't expect the employee to actually change their behavior. Because simply saying you're not doing this fast enough, you're not doing it well enough, that's not enough. You need to be a coach and mentor to your team members, and you need to work with them to improve. I don't have a problem when an employee makes a mistake,
No.
screws up, misses a
Right.
deadline, something like that, as long as they learn from it
Right.
and don't do the exact same thing again.
Right.
Nobody is perfect. We're all going to make mistakes. They need to feel comfortable owning up to their mistakes and sharing with you that something is wrong.
Right.
So part of this is the culture that you're creating. And if your culture is tisk tisk shame on you, you will not ever have that opportunity to coach and mentor.
Yeah, I think you're right. The never canceling one-to-ones, always have like to being consistent about it, making sure that you're listening and asking the right questions. This employee of mine, I kept digging and digging and I couldn't get it. And then finally I was like, are you telling me the truth? And she put her head down and said no. And I was like, finally we're getting somewhere. But
Right.
it took a really long time for me to get there because she just was not comfortable saying this client is being terrible because she didn't know if it was her fault or and no, like I don't put up with that. So we immediately fired that client. But
Yeah.
you have to be really, and you have to be patient because sometimes it doesn't come out in the first or second conversation.
Right. And it all goes back to what you said early on in this conversation, which is who are you hiring?
Yep.
The recruiting, and I say this about a lot of things, whether it's about client retention or employee retention, it all goes back much earlier than we think. And so, just as I say, onboarding doesn't start on the first day that someone's an employee or a client. The behavior of the employee and their performance starts during the recruiting process. And you should be observing how
Yep.
they're handling the recruiting process.
Yep.
Because if they're sloppy in their emails, if they are slow to respond to appointment requests, if they don't
Really
respond to you
great
out of
points.
hours,
Yep.
all of these things are not going to improve once they're an
Right.
employee.
Right.
There are certainly cases where people overperform during the interview process and the recruiting process and then disappoint you. I have never seen a case where someone went from mediocre in the hiring process to a star later.
Never. Never.
So if you are
Never.
seeing someone who is not a star in the way that they are performing, the way that they're appearing, are they showing up late to the Zoom for the interview? All of these things are signals that you need to look to. And how they're handling those things are a good indication of how they're going to be as an employee. So you need to do a better job of recruiting. You need to be willing to keep a seat empty if you don't have the right person to put in that role, rather than just putting a warm body in the seat. Because if you do, you're just delaying when this problem is going to pop up. And it just doesn't make any
100%.
sense. So if you've got a problem, the mirror is the place to look.
Yep, totally.
I know you don't want to hear that.
You don't want to hear
not
that.
Not you.
Right,
you know
right.
this, but
yeah.
Listeners don't want to hear this.
Yeah, it's true. And I think, I do recognize the fact that things have changed and that there are, workplace has changed, culture has changed, society has changed. But if you're recruiting and hiring the right way, and you're setting expectations, and you've built a culture that allows for flexibility as well as urgency, then I think you're going to be much better off than just expecting that your younger generation employees are going to figure it out, even though they've only been out of college for 2 years.
Yeah. And the last piece of blame that I'm going to throw at the owner's feet here, because this is a trash owner's show apparently now for me. which I'm sure will help me in generating new clients. I'm sure
Yes, it will.
Anyone listening to this is going to be like, oh, I want to hire Chip so he can beat up on me.
Yeah, well, he does beat up on you, so.
But in a kinder, gentler
It is in
way.
a kind way. It is.
Yeah. Pricing. Part of the reason why you're worried that your employees don't have a sense of urgency is because you're asking them to do too much because you didn't price appropriately, so you can't resource appropriately.
Yep.
And so a lot of this can be also alleviated if you're resourcing correctly. So it's one thing if you've got an employee who, is supposed to be full-time and, doesn't want to put in more than 20 hours a week. But in a lot of these cases, you're asking them to go above and beyond.
Right.
And when I dig into these things, and they're just not willing to step up when we need it. What they're saying is they're not willing to stay an extra couple of hours working on a project or something like that. And a lot of times, it's not because there's something truly urgent or an emergency. It's because you didn't resource correctly, because you didn't price correctly, so you can't afford the staffing that you need, whether that's employees, contractors, or what have you. So look in the mirror, solve recruitment, have those one-on-ones, and for God's sakes, price correctly.
Love it. Great advice.
That will end my rant and probably my business. So with that, we'll draw this episode to a close before I dig my hole any deeper. I'm Chip Griffin.
I'm Jenny Dietrich.
And it depends.